Thanks very much for having us. Thanks to Alex and to David. We were participating in a 2018 conference in Edinburgh on where we gave an earlier paper, one of our papers on this topic, something which, as some people know, we've been working on for a long time. Let me start with some stories though, which maybe are which I think might help to frame at least how I think about this problem. When I started to think about this, I thought back to my own experience. Personal experience isn't usually a very good introspection. Isn't really a good way to do macroeconomics for sure. I'm not sure it's a very good way to do microeconomics either. But it's more fun, and you can tell the stories. Tell the stories in a more genuine way. So when I was an undergraduate, now 50 years ago, I hate to say, I'm not the support of the distribution in this room. I know that, but I'm close. So when I was an undergraduate, and I was at this place called the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, my undergraduate friends and classmates wanted to do things like cure cancer or create room temperature superconductors or colonize space, or even then, create artificial intelligence of various kinds. Or in 1995, when I was teaching, the best students wanted to be hedge fund managers. So that seems like, at least at a minimum, an allocation problem that's created by finance. Now, of course, that's a bad story if I want to talk about too much finance, because that's not too much finance. That's just finance being generally bad. But then if you start to look and you say, well, what is finance actually doing? Well, we've had a couple of nice discussions already about that. But one way to think about it is that we think of finance as existing to reduce certain frictions that we see in the economy, frictions associated with things like information problems, with things then reducing adverse selection, reducing moral hazard, things like facilitating transfers that might be difficult. Torsten mentioned specialization. There also are economies of scale associated with this, and you have to figure out how to put big things together and stuff. For those of you that have been involved, there are these weirdo websites that have been around now for a long time, where you can actually finance things yourself. You put in $5,000 and then dole it out in $50 increments to people who want to borrow money or something like that. Now, I like watching sports, so that's what I do for entertainment. I don't do that. That seems like a really bad, really inefficient way to do things, and that's probably why it hasn't been very successful. Banks are actually way better at it than I am, even with the information. But the problem is that the value added in finance, which is not necessarily value added, that's just a term that I'm going to use, it's the technical term, is probably something in the range of 4 to 5% of GDP in the global economy. It's more here, more like, I guess we saw from Torsten, I think more like 9. In the US, it's more like 7. I would guess in Switzerland, it's astronomically higher. But in any case, globally, it's a number like 4 to 5%, and global GDP is a number like, at market prices, $110 to $120 trillion. So what you're looking at is numbers like $5 or $6 trillion in terms of the amount of the reward, if you will, to finance. Now, that seems like an awful lot of money in order to reduce frictions. And so at the more aggregate level, you can look and you can say, well, why are we spending so much to reduce frictions? Well, probably the answer is that there's a lot of rent collection going on in that part of the world. And if you look at how much people are actually paid, I should say 4 to 5% of GDP of value added, but only 1 to 2% of employment. So obviously, then this is a very lucrative business, and getting a very small slice, even a really small slice of that $4 to $5 trillion, makes you really, really wealthy. Okay, so then you go and you look and you read the news recently and you discover that this year, although this is a very bad, total misrepresentation, but it still makes for good news headlines, that Jamie Dimon was compensated $770 million for 2025. That's not really true, because a lot of that was his ownership share in Citi. And so it was actually equity appreciation. And so he could have been anybody who owned that, and he would have been made that in terms of his apparent compensation. But anyway, if you look and you say, well, how is it that these hedge fund managers can make $2 billion a year or something like that? And you say, well, this just looks like some sort of a misallocation. But at the same level, we know that finance is really essential, because without finance, we can't actually get anything done, because I can't go out and raise money. I can't, go on to some website as an entrepreneur and get somebody to finance my startup. That just doesn't work. And it doesn't work for a whole lot of reasons. And so the reason that we have angel investing in venture capital is order to get those entrepreneurs going. And they're actually serving a very, very good function. And their return on capital in the end is actually not that much better than it is anywhere else. It's certainly not risk adjusted. But anyway, so the point is that it really looks like there should be some point where we see things that look like this. Now, this is the reason this doesn't look, by the way, as inverted U-shaped as other people's do, is because this is in levels. It's in more natural units, which is the ratio of total private credit to GDP on the horizontal axis and annual growth rates. We estimate these things in logs, so you got to do. After you're done exponentiating them, they look a little bit different, but they still peak because they're still quadratic terms, but they look like this. The little diamond is at the peak. And one of the interesting things that I'm going to discuss, and the main thing I'm going to discuss, is that Anise and I believe that the peak in this has actually fallen in the last 20 years. If you just look at the data that we look at. So this is the main result is just in this picture here. And you can see that number there is nowhere near actually what we've seen before, which are numbers that are closer to 100. This number is closer to 50. And so the question is why might that be the case? So the first thing is that I'll show you, confirm that too much finance is a drag on growth. We look at GDP per worker, GDP per capita, total factor productivity. Generally, we're looking at credit, total credit or bank credit. In earlier work, we looked at employment and we looked at value added. Those data are harder to get for a lot of countries. But if you look at them, you get similar results. I don't think that this result is solely a consequence of looking at credit. I should say that, like if I go back and think about it hard, I always wondered why I looked at credit to GDP anyway. Dividing stocks by flows always seemed pretty weird. But it's what everybody kind of does, and it seems to work okay. Although the units are strange. It does look like the turning point's lower, and so the real question that we ask is why that's the case. So the outline of what I'll do is I'll talk about I'm not going to talk much about the data because I'm going to try and go quickly. I'll just say that we have data from 1969 to 2019. It's a little bit less. We didn't do what Ugo and his colleagues did, which is to just dump what was in the World Bank's database. I guess we could have done that. We would have had many more countries for sure. We have 22 advanced and 18 emerging market countries, and we're able to collect data on most of these for the things that we're looking at. We estimate this nonlinear relationship when we examine turning points and look for explanations. Okay, so at the risk of, I have a general rule about equations on slides, which is that you lose half the audience with each equation. Well, I have two, so they're going to be a quarter of you will be left at the end. 75%. So,
It's exponential.
but this is the first equation we've seen, I think, so far today. So we'll see. But anyway, maybe by the end, if it's cumulative, which I'm not sure. But anyway, but this is just for those of you that like equations. What's important about this? Oh, yeah, I guess it's true. You had one equation. Yeah, one. Okay, so we look at 5-year changes in the log of some measure of output. So that's a 5-year average annual growth rate. We have in the baseline we have country and time fixed effects. There are a bunch of controls. One of the most important controls that we have is beginning of period level. So the beginning of period level of the left-hand side variable, and that's to account for these catch-up effects. This is pretty standard in the growth literature, and it matters quite a lot. And then there's a measure of the size of the financial system. The hypothesis then is that the linear term has a positive coefficient, and that the quadratic term has a negative coefficient. Pretty simple. You can compute the turning point just as this simple ratio here. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. And here's some numbers. And I just want to start out by saying that this is pretty common in the growth literature. It really looks as if there are constant returns to scale in these in the economy. That's kind of interesting. There aren't increasing returns to scale. So this is this old debate about solo growth models versus endogenous growth models. So those numbers are close to 1. That's not that interesting, maybe. That's the catch-up term. The catch-up term is very important. That means that the countries that are not at the frontier are catching up to the frontier more rapidly than the ones that aren't. The most important thing is that we have an inverted U, and those are the terms that for that. The differences across the columns are important because there are slight differences in the samples that we use. The top well, I'm sorry, the differences in the columns have to do with the fixed effects. So I'll come to those in a moment. The top ones here are for the log of private credit to GDP, and the bottom two are for bank credit. And so there's an obviously a potentially large difference between bank credit and private credit because of the existence of non-bank intermediation, which in different countries can be of varying size. In some countries, market-based finance is up to say 2/3 or even 70% of the total financial system in highly financialized economies, and so that can be pretty that difference can be pretty important. If you look at the turning point estimates, in the first and the third column here are numbered 2 and 2, unfortunately, because I ran out of time as I was doing this. And if I look at 42 and 50, those are the numbers that are slightly lower. I'll talk about the other numbers a bit later when we come to that, because the difference here is whether or not there are time fixed effects in the regression or not. That turns out to be a pretty critical thing, and something that we might want to think about more going forward. So here's what these terms look like. These things look like if I look at the private credit and GDP growth per worker. The paper has GDP growth per capita as well as GDP growth per worker, and total factor productivity as well. And you get somewhat similar results. As I said, the peak is around 50% in this. The far right is a measure of in some sense the derivative. So it's telling you what the slope is here. And the important thing is that as you go far out here, the slope is actually not that big. So a 10 percentage point increase in credit from 100 to 110% of GDP would reduce average GDP growth by 1/10 of a percentage point per year on average. I guess you can decide for yourself whether you think that's a big number, given the sort of given the sort of noise that we generally see in GDP growth, does not strike me as being a terribly large number. So now the question is, why did this thing fall? Maybe it's the sample period. I think we actually saw a lot of sample period stuff already that showed that the sample period doesn't seem to matter hugely. The time fixed effects matter. We also look at banking system concentration, the ratio of bank credit to bank deposits, so how that has to do with external financing, and then the size of equity market capitalization to get a measure of public markets. It's harder to get total bond market capitalization. If I look at the sample period doesn't actually do much. Between the first row and the second row, there aren't huge differences. I realize there aren't confidence bands on these. We can construct those confidence bands, and we probably should. So we'll do that eventually, but it just isn't in this draft of the paper. And so our reading of this by looking at the two rows of this table is that there's not much difference. But if I look at the difference between the country only and the country and time fixed effects, there are huge differences. So it looks as if one of the big things that's going on here is these time fixed effects. And so what are time fixed effects? Well, time fixed effects are things that are common at a given time across all of the countries in the sample that we have. So those are things that are going on in the world. They're global. They're global factors of some sort. Now, we don't have any further discussion of these, so we don't explore what they might be. It would be hard to do that actually in this context. But I think it would be worth thinking about what those things are. Because if you just have the country fixed effects, and the country fixed effects are pretty important, you can't run these regressions without country fixed effects because the countries differ in their structures so much, you would never expect the systems to be the same as you go across. Now, if I look at for other things, this is my second equation. So now I'll lose the next quarter of you. The question here is whether or not there are factors that can explain the location essentially of the peak, things that can cause it to move, and you can do those by interacting with the financial factors, both the linear and the quadratic ones. So that's the simple way of doing that. And we look at three things: banking system concentration, the ratio of bank credit to bank deposits, and equity market capitalization. And we find relatively different things. So here, if I'm looking at banking system concentration, what I see is that there is the peak does move around. More concentrated banking systems have higher turning points. So it's possible that as banking system concentration goes up or down, you're going to move back and forth. And I think that makes some amount of sense. Obviously, the more concentrated the banking system is, the more efficient it could be for a while, but then it becomes less efficient. Okay. What about bank credit to bank deposits? This is interesting because the high bank credit to deposit ratio it leads you to not have any inverted U at all. Those things that's just not there. With higher bank credit to bank deposits, then there's no growth benefit to more credit initially, but there's also no inverted U. So that's sort of we thought that would be interesting too. And if you look at equity markets, you also get that high equity market capitalization gives you no growth benefits to more credit either. While if you have low equity market capitalization, then more credit does have this inverted U. So those are the sort of three basic results. The inverted U's remaining, the turning points lower, and there seem to be a bunch of possible explanations. The banking system concentration, the sources of bank funding, and the market equity market capitalization affect the shape of this thing. But the thing that really seems to be important in a first order sense are these global factors that we're not able to model, at least not in the setup that looks like this. And does create somewhat of a difference between what at least our work and some others look like in the past. So let me stop there and hope that I didn't take up too much time. Let's see. Fine. Sure.
What shall I do? Just put it. Yeah. I want to thank David and Alex for inviting me to discuss this paper and to enjoy this great conference. I'm privileged. In fact, it's an honor for me to discuss a paper by the leaders in the field, together with, of course, Hugo and Jean-Louis and Enrico. So these are the two teams of researchers that started up the debate, in both working in policy institutions such as the IMF and the BIS. And it's surprising that given that the authors of the leaders in the literature are from these institutions, we still are concerned about the insufficient policy relevance of the topic. We just heard the dense presentation by Steve, and I would summarize it. It's a reassessment. The paper in 2026, in fact, revisits and refines the earlier paper, and partly undermines or updates, corrects, not simply shifts, as they put it in the title, their key findings. The main difference is, as I can kind of see them at a very general, big level, they extend the sample period from about 30 years to 20 years more, 21 years more. They reduce the country coverage. There are some 22 economies are advanced and 11 and 18 are emerging. They improve the econometrics. And I think the crucial point here is that in the first paper, they didn't include time-fixed effects at all. Now they add them. And so they capture common global dynamics, which for me is very influential. They also have more variables to proxy additional dimensions of finance. Their principal empirical results are to some extent shaken. I would not say overturned. Basically, the tipping point lowers to ice from about 80 to 100 in the initial paper to 30 to 40 now. I'm talking about private or bank credit to GDP, and the inverted U-shape relationship disappears if stock markets are also taken into account as a key component of finance. Sorry, why am I stuck? Okay. So, to take a broader perspective, I can remind you of the process of scientific discovery, which we know from Popper, for example, 1959. Science advances via trial and error. Established results are often falsified by new, better data. I think that's the case here as well. To some extent, we have a thorough re-examination by Steve and Anis in 2026 of their paper of 2012, and they have a refinement with some reversals that are to some extent facilitated by the general question that they ask. This is in the sense of Torsten's initial presentation. We talk about finance and too much finance, and finance in quotes may mean a lot of things. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that next. We know there is a huge theoretical and empirical literature on finance and growth, originally the finance growth nexus, and later on the too much finance. Again, in the morning, Torsten covered a lot of that. We have a lot of conceptual problems here in the theory part. There is a dual usage of financial intermediation. There are two classifications, broad functional definition, markets and institutions. We have narrow institutional definition. Financial institutions are dozens of different institutions. Financial markets are another dozen of different types of markets. On top of that, we have financial innovation, fintech, mobile banking, cryptocurrency now, stablecoins, green finance, financial fraud, financial pyramids, Ponzi schemes. So finance means a lot. It's too general. From the empirical side, again, the literature has used, again, 20, 30 different proxies. These are proxies to the general notion of finance. So again, I don't want to go into much detail, but there are, first of all, measures of bank-based finance, size and depth indicators. We may basically use private credit by deposit money banks to GDP, but also there are efficiency indicators, for example, net interest margins, because finance in the nexus to growth would imply efficient allocation of credit from savers to investors with profitable, good, productive projects. Access indicators. On the other side, we have market-based finance, which has been kind of omitted in the earlier literature. And so I was positively, I like the extension that Steve and Enis doing this second extended updated paper, because they look at stock market capitalization to GDP, so which is one of the possibilities to measure the market-based part of finance. Of course, there are a lot of composite indices. The two most famous references are IMF's work, 2015, Sahai et al., and 2016, Svitzenka. So this is on financial deepening, on indices of financial deepening. Now, I'm putting here an animated graph, which should be working, but it's not. Sorry about that. It worked during the break. So that fails me. I wanted to be a little bit modern and show you this graph developing, but the point of this graph, sorry for not working on that, is that I show you here 6 leading world economies, and I show you a measure of bank finance, which is the solid lines, and the measure of dashed lines, which is the market-based finance. And generally, in the critical periods of the crisis, Japan's crisis, the dot-com crisis, the global financial crisis, they have opposite trends. Really apologize for why is this not working? I have no idea. Again, this is the issue that was raised in the morning of long-run trends versus short-term cycles. To what extent we uncover a long-run relationship, and to what extent we uncover some cyclical components. This graph was also intended as an animation. It shows the coverage of bank-based finance across the world over the last years, and it shows gradually that the data, the white spaces on the map become measurable. There are data, and this increases over the years. Again, so basically, my message with the graphs that were intended to be animated was to show that first, there are different measures, there are different trends in these measures. One of them reflects bank-based finance, the other reflects market-based finance. Anyway, so I like the paper. Definitely, it's a progress from the earlier one. It looks to me pretty much complete, convincing, well-written, and self-contained. It definitely stands out as more solid and more thoroughly explored compared to 2012. The methodological improvements, result refinements, and enrichment add to knowledge. This revised and extended work definitely moves in the right direction for research, which I think is to more detail and disaggregation, to uncover the channels behind the big label of finance. So what are the channels that are on a disaggregated level producing this efficiency of intermediation in credit? Right, so as in the similar and parallel work that we saw presented in the morning by Hugo, the main result here is also too much finance. But the turning point is a little bit different, higher in the work by Hugo and Quarters and a little bit smaller in the revised version of Steve and Ennis. So I have not much to say on how to further enhance this empirical build-up of an expanding project over 40 years. Perhaps on the econometric side, maybe report a Hausmann test to justify the choice of a fixed effect over random effect specification. To address endogeneity issues, perhaps check robustness using instrumental variables in dynamic GMM estimation. With view to the structural heterogeneity and the often limited data coverage, which was intended to be captured by my graphs, maybe add quantile regression. So the different parts of the distribution may have different effects of finance and the link of finance and growth and the connection to too much finance. And of course, they do that, check at least these two samples more carefully. Are there any differences between advanced and emerging economies? So my last slide, what further research on finance and growth? I rather have a view of or a recommendation to this strand of literature as a whole, which goes a little bit in the direction of Thorsten in the morning. So I want to see some more explicit theoretical structural quantitative models that either predict ex ante, that is, imply hypotheses that we can test empirically, or we have a pattern of data and then theory conceptualizes it, rationalizes it. So the interest should be more into these specific channels of causal or feedback effects by inspecting the mechanisms from finance to growth a step at a time in the multitude and the endogeneity of these connections. And so that would most likely generate at the more disaggregated specific levels the accumulated aggregate data patterns and explain them. I would assess this field as a whole since the empirical work by Goldsmith in 1965, King and Levine, and Allen and Gale as too much empirics. And I propose that a natural next stage that can address from a theoretical, normative, but empirically verified positive perspective, which finance matters. So for me, the question is more which finance matters and how does it promote growth? In particular, investigating bad speculative finance or excess wasteful financialization, such as for me cryptocurrency and financial fraud, versus good optimal finance that contributes to efficiently channel savings to best productive use. To sum up, I would wish to see a gradual process of refinement of this literature in papers blending theory and empirics to investigate more specific sub-questions with a more disciplined taxonomy, terminology, and more precise wording or labeling of the research finding. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Alexander. Okay, so we might leave some time for any comments or questions before we go back to the authors. Yes, Jan.
Thank you. Again, fascinating papers, but I really want to pick up on the points that were just made by the discussant. I've had this kind of discomfort with the very aggregative things that are being done. You know, I mean, a blob of credit to GDP ratio and a blob of GDP growth and so on. And I think, in a sense, the comments just now kind of crystallized the sense in which I had that discomfort, because it's not just a question of how much finance. Isn't it critical the institutional conditions under which the finance occurs? There was a point about concentration. Well, it matters if it's public sector concentration or private, because you know the fabulous Korean experience that we already talked about was very concentrated but publicly directed. China similarly, right? Very concentrated but publicly directed. So number one is the institutional conditions, and number two is the direction of the finance, which somehow doesn't get recognized in the very aggregate relationships. And I think that direction, it came out on the second paper this morning, but perhaps that's the direction in which future research really needs to go, even the empirical research.
Any other comments or questions from the floor? The stage. Yes.
Well, that was a great comment, and it'd be lovely to see some more detailed research along the lines that you were proposing. So many options to explore. You know, for example, comparing extractive LBOs with innovative VCs which both get lumped together and referred to as private equity by policymakers without differentiating them at all. And clearly, they have very opposite impacts on the economy. I wanted to ask Stephen, actually, in light of his own research, what policy implications would he draw from his research in terms of what ought to be encouraged and what ought to be discouraged in terms of financial sector industrial strategy?
Would you like a chance to respond to that or any of the other comments so far?
I didn't actually hear that, but go ahead. He was facing the other way.
Okay, thanks for the comments and thank you for the discussion. Very useful and insightful discussion. So I'll start with yours and then we'll follow up on the next ones. I think one thing that you raised is this possibility of counter-regressions, which is very interesting. And it's been actually applied in different settings, especially when it comes to this literature on growth at risk, you may be familiar with. And actually that would basically encapsulate the two sides that I think Hugo was mentioning this morning, which is there is the financial development, financial deepening, which is about long-run growth. And at the same time, you have these credit booms that basically lead to financial crisis and lead to subpar economic performance. And so by looking at different quantiles of the distribution of growth, then you can basically get a sense of how both the median or the average distribution, the average of the distribution is shifting versus how the quantiles, especially the extreme quantiles, the lowest ones in particular, may be actually drifting in opposite directions. So that's something that I think is very useful, and we should. This literature should consider going forward to basically make sense of what looks on the surface like potential contradictions or at least tensions. So I won't dwell too much on the more technical issues, which I think are fully well taken and that we'll reflect on and try to implement as much as possible. There's one thing though that I'd like to mention is there is somehow there is a plus in this literature to having both AEs and EMEs within the same sample, because that's what gives you the inverted U. And somehow by splitting the two, you break it up naturally, because basically the EMEs are more to the left, the AEs are more to the right of a private credit to GDP distribution. Okay, so that's the value added, I think. So now on the next questions. So I understand your discomfort with the aggregate data. We do have the same, but what Steve presented was precisely kind of somehow trying to go in this direction and trying to get a sense of what is basically behind this inverted U. Okay, so we haven't exhausted the question for sure, but typically this point about concentration, for example, there's a lot of controversy about what should be the appropriate policy, competition policy for finance, for the financial sector, for banks in particular. Okay, and obviously that should have implications for what is the spillover from finance to growth, and that's what we show in the data to some extent. So obviously you can do more and you can disentangle whether concentration comes from the public sector banks versus whether it's really concentration in terms of private sector participants. There is a big issue, which is data limitations there, and that's not very, concentration itself is, there is a lot of controversy about what's the appropriate way to measure it, let alone kind of disentangling and whether it makes sense to disentangle between different types of institutions and what are the relevant markets over which you should measure concentration. But that's exactly where we want to go. The same thing. When we show that basically the impact of credit, of additional credit, is different depending on the funding model or the funding structure of banks, according to the bank credit to bank deposits. That's exactly also going this way, And there is kind of something that I think Steve, for the sake of time, didn't really spend time on, but there is this trade-off that you observe, which is in countries where banks rely a lot on deposits and arguably less on their own capital to extend lending. You do see that basically the impact of credit is kind of more uniformly negative, but at the same time, growth is higher. And so there is a trade-off there, you want high growth, but you want to also avoid the negative potential impact of additional credit, and the same for the stock market. Having a big stock market is good because from the regressions, not from what I'm saying, you see that predicted growth is higher, but at the same time, additional credit in an economy where the stock market is large, presumably doesn't go to the right projects, doesn't go to the most profitable or TFP enhancing activities. And you see that basically in the data, actually, it does correlate, it does come up with lower growth going forward. So there are these interesting trade-offs that show up in the data. Once basically you try to disentangle what is the impact of this additional credit in this situation versus another one. And so that's exactly what we're trying to do. Maybe we're still falling short. Maybe we need to do more. But basically, we're on I think we very much agree on basically the plan forward.
I think we should probably move on to the next paper if it's okay, Max. I might get you to hold that until if there's some time at the end of the session. So we might move on to the next paper, which is Anamika Sen and Ezra Gulu. I'll get the slides ready for you.
Technically, it's a bit difficult because it's a panel. The fixed effects, they're not linear, so you cannot just have fixed effects. But some people have done.
No, I'm not suggesting that.
It's not very.
I'm somehow terrible at the full screen of the PDF, so I don't know if you can manage that.
You're always going to reject.
Yeah,
That should just be in state.
Steve, you're always going to reject.
Is that right?
Test will always reject.
Oh, okay, that's good to know.
Because basically your fixed effects are correlated with all of the areas.
Well, that's
And that's what makes it reject.
Right. Hi, everyone. I'll take off my mask while presenting. I don't have COVID or flu, so I don't want to make anyone feel nervous. I'm Esra Orlu, so we will be jointly presenting our work with my colleague Anamika Sen. And the title of our paper is Credit Liberalization and the Shift to Household Lending. But before I start, I would also like to thank Alex and David for the invitation to this great conference. It's a great opportunity for us to be presenting our work alongside many names in this audience whose work has been informative for ours. So I'm going to present the first part, which is the easier part, and then I'm gonna then Anamika will take over from me. So I would like to start with explaining what motivated us to write this paper. As it's been discussed since the morning, there's been a dramatic growth of credit in general, but particularly household credit across the globe, particularly since the 1980s. When we look at the data, we see that banks have started kind of shifting from their textbook role of providing working capital to businesses and more towards lending to households. And as we all know, credit allocation has implications for various economic indicators, including long-run growth, income and wealth inequalities, and financial stability. And there are two different set of theories that try to explain this growth in household lending, demand side and supply side explanations. So the demand side explanations focus on worsening income distribution, especially in advanced economies, as a factor that contributed to larger demand for household lending. Whereas the supply side explanations focus more on increased ability and willingness of banks to lend to households. And in our paper, we focus more on the supply side drivers of this phenomenon. And more specifically, we want to understand the effect of removal of credit controls on both the share of household credit in total credit, but also the size of household credit, so household credit as a share of GDP. There are a lot of similarities between credit controls that we are analyzing and some of the more kind of modern macroprudential tools, which has kind of led to a renewed interest in studying the effectiveness of these tools. But as far as we're aware, there haven't been really a lot of studies that look at the effectiveness of credit controls on credit allocation. So we are kind of trying to address this gap in the literature. Some spoilers. So we find that relaxation of credit controls led to a consistent increase in both the share and the size of household credit. So over the 15 years post-liberalization, we found that household credit share and size increased by an average of 41 and 61% respectively. And we checked the robustness of our findings to various controls that account for increase in demand for household credit. We also find that the effects of relaxation of credit controls depend on the initial structure of credit controls and the extent of liberalization. And Anamika will talk about these results in more detail. Our paper speaks to two bodies of literature. Some of this has already been covered in the morning sessions. The first is the literature that analyzes the macroeconomic effects of private credit expansions. And it's been shown that shift to household lending has been linked to several different adverse macroeconomic outcomes. And with our paper, we basically try to understand the extent to which relaxation of credit controls may have contributed to some of these adverse outcomes. And the second literature that we try to speak to looks at the effects of financial regulations on the banking sector and real outcomes. So there have been some recent papers looking at the effects of credit controls on things like innovation, banking crises, output, and inflation. The only paper that speaks to the relationship between credit controls and composition of bank lending is by Bessemer et al. 2023. We built on this paper, we draw a lot from it, but we also, I think, differ from it in, I would say, two important ways. One is that our focus is just limited to credit controls as opposed to analyzing kind of various set of credit liberalization, financial liberalization tools. And we try to do a more in-depth study that kind of combines quantitative tools with a qualitative analysis of IMF Article 4 reforms. So that's how we kind of try to distinguish ourselves from the Bessemer et al. Paper. To give a bit of institutional context and talk about our data, so in the years that followed the Second World War, credit controls were used both by advanced and developing countries, primarily as a way to channel credit to strategically important sectors. As we saw in the South Korea example, this was typically heavy manufacturing, and this was done by providing credits at concessional rates. There were also restrictions on credit provided to households and other sectors that were deemed less desirable. In addition to being used as an industrial policy tool, credit controls were also used as a monetary policy tool because there was this view that interest rates were not the most kind of effective way of conducting monetary policy. But during the 1980s, credit controls were largely abandoned as part of kind of broader financial liberalization efforts following the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. When they were in place, credit controls took typically three different forms. So there were direct floors and ceilings on credit to specific sectors. So this is kind of the most obvious way of implementing credit controls. But there were also liquidity or reserve requirements that were linked to the portfolio composition of banks, and rediscount ceilings. So these were the three different ways of implementing credit controls. Our data covers 27 countries, so 20 of which is advanced economies and 7 developing countries. Our maybe country sample is not very large, but our time span is quite large. So our data, I think we didn't put this here, but it starts from 1974 up until, I want to say 2004 or 2014. So our household credit data comes from Global Credit Project of Müller and Werner, which is a very nice paper that was cited in one of the presentations earlier. So this is kind of one of the first projects to provide historical data on composition of bank lending. So that data wasn't available before at that frequency. And our credit control data comes from an IMF database called IMF Financial Reform Database, which is quite widely used in this literature. Our measure of credit controls basically speaks to these 3 different types of credit controls that were quite common. So the data on credit controls is an index that can take on 4 different values ranging from 0 to 1, 0 being fully repressed and 1 being kind of a fully liberalized system. And whenever this index increases in value, we consider that as a liberalization event. So that's a liberalization of credit controls. So the data that we're using is a binary one. And finally, we have some narrative data. As I mentioned earlier, we analyzed IMF Article 4 reports. We do this for every country in our sample for 3 years preceding the liberalization events. So this narrative data provided us with a lot of contextual information about kind of the conditions under which liberalization events took place. And this essentially helped us understand what kind of confounders we needed to control for and whether the reforms were anticipated. And if so, how can we kind of account for that in our econometrics estimations? And in a sense, it also helped us understand the endogeneity or exogeneity of the liberalization events vis-a-vis composition of bank lending. This graph shows, this is a heat map of the liberalization events. So the purple kind of color is the fully liberalized, and yellow colors are, or is it the opposite here? It is the opposite, sorry. So purple is the fully repressed and the yellow is the fully liberalized. One important feature of this graph is that you can see that liberalization events took place in different points of time in different countries. So they were kind of staggered over time. And in our econometric strategy, we make use of this staggered nature of the liberalization events to try to kind of estimate or to try to identify some causality. So this is an important feature of our data. And finally, before I leave the stage for Anamika, this table shows household credit share and size pre and post liberalization events. And we can see that both the share and size of household credit has increased quite significantly during the post-liberalization years. Okay, so now Anamika will take over from me.
All right, okay. So time for me to undo some of the hard work Esther has done by putting up an equation. So the first thing we do when it comes to empirics here is we start with a very simple two-way fixed effects regression, since we just want to see whether there is in fact any correlation between the relaxation of credit controls and our household credit variables. So again, very simple. Our dependent variable is the log of household credit. And so this allows us to interpret our coefficients more easily. And our key independent variable is simply the index of credit controls, which can take 4 possible values, with higher values meaning more liberalization. We have both country and year fixed effects, and we also include a battery of controls that we identified based on our reading of the literature and we think are relevant for our analysis. Again, this is pretty standard, so I don't want to spend too much time on the little details unless there are questions. So what are our key takeaways? Our key takeaway here is if we focus on the first row, you will see across all specifications, from the most limited specification to the most saturated, a relaxation of credit controls is positively correlated with, in this case, the share of household credit, and also similarly household credit size. So we do see a positive correlation here. So just to provide context to all these numbers, so if we look at our most saturated model, you would see a single point increase. So it's a 0.33 in this case, since our index can take only 4 possible values and the increments are in 0.33. So a small single point increment in our credit liberalization index is associated with roughly a 7% increase in household credit share and almost a 10% increase in household credit size. So pretty significant if you think about just the magnitude of these effects. And then we also, to add additional context, we just took the case of France's transition from a very strict credit regime where it had an index of 0 to quite a liberal one. And we would anticipate that in this case, we would expect a substantial increase in both their credit share as well as size. So this initial analysis kind of sets the stage for our more rigorous and causal analysis. So as Ezra mentioned, our graph showed that credit liberalization policies were introduced in a staggered fashion across countries. And as the current diff and diff literature has time and again kind of shown, that in such circumstances, using the two-way fixed effects regression kind of leads to biased estimates. So we decided to go with one sort of estimator here, which is kind of relatively new in this space, but I think fits our context quite well. So this is the local projections diff and diff estimator. So it kind of combines pieces of both, as I will show in the next slide. But the key sort of important part of this estimator is that it allows us to use only clean controls. So countries that are yet to receive treatment, in our case, as sort of the kind of counterfactual for countries that are undergoing liberalization. So this would lead us to have far better estimates of the true effect of liberalization. Our narrative analysis of IMF Article 4 reports also seem to suggest that there may have been some anticipation of reforms up to 2 years before their introduction. While this varies a lot across countries, we still want to see whether or not there was in fact any effect of the policy prior to its actual implementation. And so you will notice in all our graphs, we have like a second sort of line to indicate the start of an anticipation window. All right, so our equation here, again, fairly simple. So on the left-hand side, for anyone who's familiar with the local projections method, this looks very much like what a local projections equation would look like. So on the left-hand side, what we're essentially doing is we're taking long differences between our outcome variable of interest, so that's either household credit share or size of the year, and comparing it to the year immediately before the country underwent liberalization. So T-1 is the year before a country underwent liberalization, and then the T plus age kind of allows us to project forward. And we also look backwards to see if there is any evidence of parallel trends or its violation. Our key independent variable is essentially a dummy that will take the value 1 once a country undergoes liberalization. So in our context, we only focus on the very first instance of liberalization, just because the events are too close to each other to actually isolate the effects of each independent event. So we choose to focus on only the very first one. And the raw data suggests that this actually captures most of the effects simply because a lot of countries had drastic changes in their index. So we're capturing at least a fairly good amount of the effect. So moving ahead, so these are our very baseline results. So in our most basic framework, we don't have any controls, although we do introduce controls in our robustness check. So in our very basic framework, we see if first focusing on the period to the left of our dotted line. So these are the periods prior to the implementation of credit control relaxation. We see that there is no evidence of a violation of parallel trends since all the coefficients are insignificant and not very different from zero. So we can conclude that countries that are liberalizing versus countries that were yet to liberalize in a given year, there wasn't a significant difference in their trends in both household credit share or size prior to the event. However, post-liberalization, we can see a clear and sustained increase in both the credit share and size. And as Esra mentioned earlier, if we average across all the post-treatment periods, we estimate that household credit share roughly increased by 40% in the 15 years post-liberalization, and household credit size by 60%. So this is averaging across all periods. The other sort of interesting thing to take away is that if we focus on this between the two dotted lines, so this one marks the start of the anticipation period, and the second one marks the actual time when the liberalization event took place. So notice that we don't really see much of an effect there either. So it's what we take away from this is that the effects of liberalization only occurred after the actual implementation of the policy rather than beforehand. And this makes sense to us simply because these credit controls were fairly binding, they were strict, and so it's unlikely that banks were able to do much before the actual policy was relaxed. They might have prepared themselves for it, but they couldn't really actually change their portfolios. So one of the things that we did do is we wanted to account for the possibility that changing credit demand might explain some of these effects. And so we look at two different possible controls for credit demand. So one is income inequality, which could be a proxy for demand for households for more credit. The other is the liberalization of securities markets, because again, these liberalization policies didn't really occur in isolation. There was a lot of other financial deregulation going on. So one possibility is that firms might have had more options to borrow from outside of banks, right? So the liberalization of securities markets might give at least larger and more reputable firms other ways to raise capital. But we see that accounting for either of these indicators still allows us to find those results. Our results are robust. And that's true for both our share and size. We also do a bunch of other robustness checks that in the interest of time, I won't get into, but always happy to talk more during the discussion. But the one sort of final kind of result that I do want to show is these sort of heterogeneous effects based on where a country started from, and then a second set which is where a country ended at. So in our first set, we look at whether starting from a very restrictive system, so whether you're starting at 0 for the index or you're starting at a number that's not 0, so at least you're partially liberalized, does it matter for the effects on household credit? And so we get some pretty interesting results here where we see that if you are a country that began at a very restrictive system and you are sort of undergoing liberalization, the effects of it on household credit don't actually show up till much later in our sample period. Meanwhile, partially liberalized countries kind of see that effect pretty much instantaneously. We have some hypotheses about why this might be that I'll get into in a second, but we thought this sort of divergence is quite interesting to point out. And we see this in both the share and the size. The other sort of interesting thing from a heterogeneity perspective is where a country ends up post-liberalization. So are you moving entirely to a score of 1, so you've entirely liberalized your financial system, or have you moved to a score that's less than 1, so you have liberalized, but you're not completely liberalized? So here again, we see some interesting divergences where if you went to completely a fully liberalized system, you do see the positive effects, but they kind of dampen towards the end of the sample. So it seems like they sort of stabilize and it dampens. However, if you only partially liberalize, there actually seems to be an acceleration after a few years. So just to sort of think about why we might be seeing these differences, we came up with a couple of different hypotheses that, at least at this time, we don't really know how we would test just simply because of data limitations, but we think they at least give us things to think about. So thinking about why the starting point might matter. So while it's true that having more relaxed credit controls means that banks could pursue more profitable opportunities for who they lend their money to, it is also true that the business of lending to firms is very different from the business of lending to households. And from a bank's perspective, they might actually need to change some of their infrastructure to sort of reorient and sort of pursue the most profitable opportunities for them. So thinking about lending to businesses is often like more relationship based and has a different type of requirement compared to lending to households, which is often very standardized and requires completely different infrastructure. So this all would take time, which might explain why we see that countries that start from a very restrictive system don't really see that increase in household credit till much later on, which might just be the time that banks take to reorient their portfolios. The other possibility that we would have loved to test out, but unfortunately, after a lot of struggles, we were still not able to get this data, is that our index is capturing an aggregation of all the different types of credit controls, whereas it's possible that the specific type of which type of credit control you're liberalizing might have implications for how lending gets reallocated. So if it is the case that certain types of credit controls, like related to sectoral allocation requirements, were liberalized later, we might not actually see these effects on household credit till later in our sample. So again, this was something that we would have loved to test out, but after a lot of data struggles, realized it was not possible. And then finally, thinking about why it is the case that where you end up might lead to heterogeneous effects. It's possible that if you have partially liberalized, you might undergo subsequent periods of liberalization because there's more for you to go to. And generally, we see in our data that most countries try to eventually liberalize all the way to the score of 1. And so that might explain why we see that acceleration after a few years, because it might correspond roughly with when they underwent the next treatment. But because of sort of how much causality demands of our data, we weren't able to actually test this. All right, so just to briefly conclude, so we see in our paper that the liberalization of credit controls is linked both to a rise in the share as well as the size of household credits. And we see that these results are largely driven by countries where their credit systems were already partially liberalized. So that's what our heterogeneity analysis shows us. But thinking ahead to what all our results mean from more of a modern policy perspective, it's important for us to also reflect on the fact that credit controls didn't really operate in isolation. These were also periods when there was a lot more state ownership of banks. And so it is possible that these kind of work together to have the type of credit allocation that might be associated more with positive growth effects. So if you think about the current context, if we do agree that there is too much finance, I think we also need to think about what are from a policy perspective, be more careful about what it is that we do, because it doesn't seem like simply bringing in credit controls will be enough, and we'd have to think more creatively about the policy. All right, with that, thank you very much for listening.
So, I believe we have the discussing comments now.
I'd like to start by thanking the organisers for holding this conference at LSE, which has made it possible for me to attend. But I'd like to go on with a couple of apologies. First one is I haven't got any slides. So you'll just have to listen to me. Apologies for that. The second is that the only thing that I'm really capable of talking about is the experience of my own country, the UK, with various kinds of credit controls. So it's going to be very sort of specific UK oriented. The main occasion when credit controls were dropped in the UK was in 1971 with competition and credit control, which was actually slightly a few years before that period, their data period begins, which was 1974, which is actually rather a pity because it was a major change, a major decline in credit controls. And I don't actually believe that it led at that time to any major shift from manufacturing to households. But in part, this was because we ran into difficulties in 1973 and had introduced the corset. Now, the corset was not a control with any intention or kind of desire to lead to a change in the direction of credit. It was not a directional credit control. It was only an attempt to reduce the rate of growth of overall bank lending and bank deposits. So it wasn't your typical kind of credit control that the authors are talking about. And that was removed in, I think it was 80 or 81, I can never remember exactly. And it led very quickly to a massive decline in manufacturing, bank lending to manufacturing. But I would claim, and I think that virtually all analysis, historical analysis, indicates that this was nothing to do with the removal of the corset. It was actually to do with the massive increase in exchange rates that accompanied this. And that leads on to a much more general point. And this is, I think, the main general point that I really want to make here, which is that you cannot introduce or maintain without serious difficulties credit controls unless you have accompanying exchange controls over the international flow of money and capital to accompany it. Because otherwise, what you will simply get is that the financing simply shifts abroad. And if financing simply shifts abroad, your banks are, with very reasonable grounds, going to complain that they're being penalized and it's not doing the job that it was supposed to do. With the result that almost all, well, I won't say almost always, a very large proportion of the occasions, the removal of credit controls, or indeed their reintroduction, is accompanied by, with the removal of exchange controls, when you're getting rid of credit controls, or if you want to reimpose credit controls, you've got to reimpose them with exchange controls. Now that means that some of the process that they have in mind may have a completely different structure. You do not remove exchange controls when your exchange rate is weak, for obvious reasons. You remove exchange controls when your exchange rate is appreciating, because that's a time when it's a lot easier to do so, and you can do so without serious problems, international problems. So one of the arrangements that may happen is that the exchange rate is appreciating. You remove exchange controls. That means your credit controls no longer work, and you get rid of them as well. But it is the increase in the exchange rates that is simultaneously happening that can lead to a decline in the competitiveness of your manufacturing, which was critical in the UK after 1981. after the removal of exchange controls and the removal of the corset in the UK at the beginning of the 1980s, the UK exchange rate went through the roof, and the manufacturing just, well, it was a disaster for British manufacturing, and lending to manufacturing ending. But that was all to do with the relationship between exchange controls, credit controls, and exchange rates. And there's no discussion about the international implications, about exchange controls. And indeed, listening to the discussion this morning, it's all been national. Everything is in national sort of silos. And finance is international. And when you're doing this kind of work, you have to think as well about the international implications of all of this. And as a generality, I would say that most of the papers here, and particularly this paper, have not done that particular thing or that particular aspect. There's another point that I would actually like to make, which is that there's a tendency to discuss this kind of analysis as sort of as if the banking systems and indeed the financial systems were sort of somehow constant, and they're not. And in particular, when countries had severe credit controls over their banks, it was quite common for the finance of households to operate through different institutions and different media. In the case of the UK, businesses, building societies, in the case of the US, S&Ls. Now, the author's data are not to be accused of this, because they use Muller and Vernier data, which are household credit provided throughout all the financial sector. So I'm not saying that this in any way is an error of your data. It's not. But in reading your paper, there's a tendency to talk about the banking system as if it was a constant, and it's not. And let me give a particular, again, example of this. When we had credit controls in the UK, we had finance of business done to the banks and finance of households done to the building societies. Come forward about sort of into the 1980s, and the building societies become banks. So if you actually looked at the banking system and you didn't realize what was going on, you would actually say, of course, there's much more household lending to households. It's just because the banking system has changed. Now, that's not true. That's not the fault of their data, because they look at household credit overall. But please don't write as if there is something called a banking system which remains unchanged over time. Neither it nor the financial system really remains unchanged. Now, I'd like to end just on the policy, I think, concern, which I share very much, that arises, is not so much that there's too much lending to households. You know, after all, we all need our mortgages. It's rather that there's not enough lending to manufacturing. One point here again, there was I can't remember which paper earlier today said about the decline in bank lending to manufacturing. But the manufacturing sector has been going down because of China. So it's the relationship between bank lending to manufacturing, and the manufacturing sector is going down in itself. So simply looking at bank lending to manufacturing if bank lending to manufacturing goes down less fast than the manufacturing sector, it's actually getting more, not less. And so you have to deal with that particular problem, as well. And lending to manufacturing has shifted increasingly to capital markets away from the banking sector. So that it's not at all clear to me that lending to big large manufacturing sectors is in any way worse. In fact, I think it's probably a lot better. The problem arises in bank lending to SMEs, who is too small to tap the capital markets. And I think that that is a problem. And the policy question is what you do about it. And here the argument is very much that you need to have smaller community banks and all that. Minsky goes into that. There's a new House of Lords report on the private sector, which goes into that as well. But that's again in declining. One of the old ways of doing it was all the big banks had masses and masses of branches, and the manager in each branch knew all the local businesses, so it was local information. And that's no longer there because branches are getting shut. And that raises one of the questions about how are we going to improve at lending to SMEs? Will AI do it? I rather doubt it. And that means it's a problem without a policy answer that I can give. So I leave that policy problem with you all.
Okay, now, any burning questions or comments? So we'll take one, we'll have a quick reaction, and then we'll go to the next.
Okay, well, I have a couple of comments. Sorry, I've tried to be short, but so first on the paper, very fascinating. I very much like the overall approach. I'm still a bit puzzled, and you mentioned it yourself, this increase in the household lending, not like a one-time shift after the credit controls go down, but a sustained increase. And I mean, so isn't that something you can actually control for? We have some hypotheses there, but I think you might actually be able to actually kind of look deeper into that. Is it specific effects going from 4 to 3 to 3 to 1, or what exactly is this about? The second point, you mentioned change in technology that you cannot really test for that. Well, there is a way to kind of dig deeper. That's by going into more granular data. I mean, you did have also during this period, at least in some countries, the entry of foreign banks, of multinational banks. And I mean, you would have to dig really deeper into terms of data on the bank level to see whether this partly might also have helped drive this move towards household credit. I mean, there's one specific region where you've seen a lot of foreign bank entry, and that's of course Central and Eastern Europe. So that's another point. I have a couple of comments actually to Charles, if I may. So number one, I really love this kind of historic view combined with cross-country work. On the exchange rate effect, I think there is this remind me of something else. So what I showed, this boom in non-tradable credits in Spain, Portugal, Greece, that was partly also an exchange rate effect, right? It was because they entered the euro area. They suddenly had all of these low interest rates, and at the same time, the manufacturing became less competitive, and voila, you get the mortgage boom. Now, I don't think anybody would argue that mortgage credit by per se is something bad, and I didn't like to say that either. It's just we don't expect the same growth effect as from firm credit. That's the only point I wanted to make. So I'm also not convinced it's really something bad unless you go into the boom bust cycles. I think also the point, actually a very valid point on the household credit, and I think it's not just about banks versus non-banks, but is it captured in our measures, right? Is it captured in this bank credit to GDP, in the private credit GDP? Is it actually in there or not? And I can give you examples out of the Latin American region, where some of this consumer credit really used to come from finance company links to department stores. And eventually they turned into banks. So they might have not been captured before, but now they're captured. I mean, there's one specific case, Banco Azteca in Mexico, which used to be like a white goods company giving credit, which I don't think at that point it was part of the banking statistics. And then it actually decided to turn into a bank, Banco Azteca. And then that thing actually probably picked up and showed up in the data. So that's an important point. And then finally, coming back to a point that Charles made, the manufacturing credit has gone down partly because manufacturing has gone down. But at the same time, we also see corporate leverage going down in general, except for the very large firms, I think, in the US. But corporate leverage has also gone down, which partly you might say, yes, okay, maybe good because they go to public capital markets, or because they rely more on internal cash flow, which again comes back to my earlier point, because certain sectors are just not the right sector, so to say, for the banking sector, because they rely on tangible assets. So maybe the whole thing towards consumer credit, maybe it's a natural development. Maybe that's because the way the real sector changes. Sorry, I talked too much. Thanks.
Okay, I'm afraid I am going to cut short the discussion on this paper. If there's anything that you'd really like to address now, otherwise you can take it up.
Yes.
Comment.
Is there anything you wanna? Yeah. I mean, I think in general, maybe I just want to very quickly say that I agree with many of the comments. Maybe one thing that I'll mention is about the changes in technology and whether we could have used more granular data. I want to say maybe we like spent and eventually wasted, I guess it was at least 1 year where we tried to work with bank level data. But the problem is that with the bank level data, the composition of bank lending is only available in like main bank level data sources in more recent years, whereas most of the liberalization events took place much earlier. So there is that like huge gap in the data, which kind of forced us to work with more macro data. And finally, on the exchange rate, I mean, my main area of research is exchange rates because I'm from Turkey and I'm obsessed with exchange rates, and I completely agree. I don't know why we didn't think about this, but I think it would be an important control to include real exchange rates to see how that affected manufacturing profitability and hence demand for credit from firms. I think we will take up on that advice. Yeah, thanks very much for all the comments in general.
Thank you. And so resist the lure of the sandwiches that are piling up in the background and hand over to Daniel Cavallo for this slide presentation. Yeah.
Okay, so good morning, and let me start by thanking the nice invitation from David and Alex to be here today, and actually for the challenge of writing this small paper. And small is the word, so I'll try to be very quick because sandwiches are arriving, and by now you're probably thinking of other things.
Throw the mouse. I did that.
The mouse?
Is the mouse there?
Okay, perfect. Okay, so the motivation was, so the point here, or the challenge was to revisit the literature, or to try to incorporate two main features in measures of financial sector. And so what I basically do is try to incorporate, on the one hand, measures that portray the whole of the financial sector. So from that perspective, they encompass not only the more typical intermediary global financial sectors, which are normally typically addressed with measures such as credit and GDP, but also other non-intermediary functions such as asset management or market making, other types of services. And on the other hand, that also capture interconnectedness across the different financial sectors to portray the complexity or the increasing complexity of these developments within the financial sector. On the other hand, that also allows me to have a bit more sector classification. So basically, I use banks, non-banks, and an aggregate for the whole of the financial sector. Now, the drawback is that the country sample is not that large. It's basically 29 European advanced economies, so most of them are OECD members. And the time period starts in 1995 and it includes a substantial portion of the post-global financial crisis period. Now, the financial sector measures are constructed using financial accounts data, so taken from Eurostat and OECD data sets. I include all types of instruments, equity instruments, debt instruments, and regarding sectors, banks are basically unmarked financial institutions. That's the statistical classification within this framework. Non-banks include insurance companies and pension funds, investment funds, and other monetary other financial intermediaries. Now, the measures per se are relatively simple, especially in the case of total financial assets. I basically look at the aggregate asset side of the balance sheets or the aggregate balance sheets for each of these three sectors that I just mentioned. Interfinancial assets, so the measure of interconnectedness. This is something that I developed in another paper. And it basically explores the fact that these data sets contain not only non-consolidated data, but also consolidated. So to the extent that non-consolidated data have all the relations of these sectors vis-a-vis all the remaining sectors, but also the connections within that specific sector, this allows me to also isolate these connections which are only established within one specific sector. So if we're talking about banks, these would be interbanking positions in different types of instruments. But for instance, if we move from our banks, this would give me the positions, for instance, of investment funds within investment funds, but also of holding, say, of pension funds in investment funds, also across the different sectors that comprise the non-bank sector. To give you an idea of the data, so these two charts have these financial sector measures in percent of GDP. This is the sample average across all the countries in the sample. The chart on your left-hand side has total assets, so broken down by the consolidated portion and the interfinancial or non-consolidated portion. And you can clearly see a very substantial increase throughout this period. So we start out more or less in 200% of GDP. There's a very substantial increase, especially in the run-up to the global financial crisis, and then some stabilization around something slightly above 600%, with the exception of the COVID period, temporarily exceeding 700%. On the right-hand side, you have a bit more detail regarding interfinancial assets. So here I've broken down into different sectoral classifications. The gray bars below are the interbanking position. These also increased a bit, not very substantially, but they increased a bit all the way up to the global financial crisis, and then again abated a bit. While at the same time, those are the black bars, you see an increase in connections between banks and central banks on the back of the non-conventional monetary policies undertaken since that period. And at the same time, the last bars, very substantial increase in the connections within the non-bank sector. So all in all, again, we move from something which is around 40% of GDP at the start of the sample to more of 100 and something percent. So again, a very substantial increase throughout the period. Now, I also have two equations, and sorry if this is this puts you off, but the empirical approach basically follows Jean-Louis and Hugo's paper 2015. I just regressed to real GDP per capita growth on the number of financial sector measures, so total financial assets and interfinancial assets for the three sectors that I mentioned on a number of control variables, all pretty standard in literature. I use both a linear and a quadratic specification. The linear specification is in log, and the other is just the financial sector measure scaled by GDP. Now, the estimation is carried out in 5-year non-overlapping averages using system GMM and most standard errors. All available lags as instruments initially, but then I do a bit of tests to the instruments after. I have two different country samples in the paper. So the first sample includes all of the countries available, but then I also, to the extent there are a number of countries with incredibly substantial financial assets in proportion to activity, I also remove these financial centers because they substantially alter the coefficients, even though the conclusion are they're qualitatively the same. The coefficients are highly affected by the presence of these countries. And so these are the results excluding financial centers. This is just a small subset of the tables in the paper with the relevant coefficients for the financial variables. And what I find throughout is a negative linear coefficient across, well, basically all the different financial sector measures and the financial sector. So for the aggregate financial sector, so banks and non-banks, and I also find a positive
Yes.
impact
Yeah,
in the case of banks
the
and
other way
in the
around.
case of non-bank, and I'll talk about this later just in a minute. Moving to intra-financial assets, here the picture is not as clear as what you see in total financial assets, but still there are instances of statistically significant negative coefficients associated with the case of the aggregate for the financial sectors, but also non-banks, albeit only weekly statistically significant. Now, there's two things I would like to mention regarding the results. So first of all, regarding the specification with the quadratic term, the turning points are close to 300%, both in the case of banks and non-banks. But that is above the 95th percentile of the distribution. So basically what this is capturing is a negative effect of financial sector size on growth over almost the entire distribution, but which is diminishing as we get to higher levels of financial debt. And the second thing that I would like to point is the fact that the Hansen tests have pretty high p-values. So I tried around with collapse matrices and restricted lag ranges. All in all, doing this exercise and arriving at Hansen tests which are more plausible, most relations remain robust in the case of total financial assets, not so much in the case of intra-financial assets. So at this stage, I take this more as exploratory, and I think the results should be taken with a bit of caution. And finally, just to quickly conclude, so I think that overall the results report the view that in advanced economies financially may hinder growth, and this is in line with other papers that have focused in samples closer to mine, so Konrad and Denk, that have a sample which is basically the OECD countries, and the paper provides additional ways of portraying the financial sector with financial measures that includes intermediation and non-intermediation activities, interconnectedness, and also a more detailed sectoral split. And I would stop here and move to you, David. Thank you.
Okay, I shall be super quick because, well, for obvious reasons. I kind of like this paper. I think it's a very interesting thing to do. I've seen some stuff that Daniel had done before on financial assets, and I think it's a kind of important thing that you want to think about. Given the heterogeneity of the financial sector, the financial activity, then it seems to me that we very much want to look at different measures of the financial sector. And as it were, if you have different measures and you get the same basic result, then this strengthens the finding. And that's sort of what this is about. So people have mainly used private credit, bank or total credit, where the latter includes shadow banks. Some financial development indices, the Sahay et al. Sri Lanka IMF stuff, also stock market capitalization or stock market turnover. There's a little bit of work on employment and financial sector, mainly by Stephen and East in their earlier paper. And there's a little bit of work on value added in the financial sector in this paper by Cornade and Denk. And I just want to say something about Cornade and Denk. Cornade and Denk are OECD economists. And we've heard lots of people today have said, this stuff originally came out from the IMF and the World Bank. Actually, it came out, the IMF and the BIS. Actually, it came out from the OECD too. And I don't know why this paper is not more widely referred to. I can't now remember how I came across it, but somehow it is not referred to. And neither of the two big papers that we had, the Alcon et al. And the Shaketi and Kharubi, referred to it. And I think there's a great deal of stuff in it. This is really, really valuable. And I should say I tried to get them to come and contribute to this, but they, I think, have both moved on within the OECD to other areas, and they were not able to do it. But I do think there's a lot of interesting things there, so I'm just giving them a plug. Okay, I think Daniel explained very well what he's doing with intra-financial assets, so I'm not going to make any, I won't go through that. The key result that he's getting is that the growth of total financial assets, which is a wider aggregate than private credit, okay, it's wider, it includes all sorts of other stuff as well, the growth of that tends to have negative effects on economic growth in this sample, which is mainly advanced economies, and in some cases with some significant quadratic effects. But the high turning points mean that in practice, the effects are essentially negative. That's not in line with the results that we get from Alcoa et al. And Cecchetti and Charoubi. On the other hand, well, there's little bits and pieces of things that you could make a connection with, but it's very much in line with the results of Gordon Denk, which, as Daniel said, has a smaller country sample, only advanced economies, and for a shorter period. Finally, just a couple of comments. That I've sort of said that already, that the prevalence of negative effects here is in line with other studies. Given the faster growth of interfinancial assets up to 2012 or so, and slower growth since then, which is obvious in the graph in particular that Daniel showed, then, I mean, and that may reflect post-crisis attempts to improve financial regulation. I don't know, but it might do. Then would it be interesting to consider a shorter period? The trouble is with a shorter period, you can't, the data that's available can't go before 1995. So you might have to kind of move to annual data, and there are kind of issues about that rather than using 5-year averages. But that might be worth looking at least in a footnote, as it were, or reporting in a footnote. And then finally, given the use in various other papers of country and time fixed effects, and in particular the very large effect of including time effects in Cecchetti and Charoubi, it seems to me that we would like to know whether that would make any difference here too. Okay, that's it.
Okay,
yeah, very, very quick question on the paper. I noticed a p-value for the J-test of 1. I think this is the Ariano bond, or I mean, I think this is over-identified. So there's a problem. Oh, sorry. I think it's over-identified.
It is. That's why.
That means these estimates are invalid. I mean, on the T statistics are biased upwards.
Indicative.
Yeah, well, so I would, then I'd rather go more or less. I mean, just you overestimate effects, basically. Not overestimate, but you overestimate the T-stats, I think. T-stat, yes.
Should I?
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, feel free.
Very quick.
Let me start. So on your comments, so in the first comment regarding the shorter time period, yes, the main issue there would be I don't have that many observations either cross section or time period, unfortunately, because of the limitations with the data. I would love to do that maybe, but that would mean, as you mentioned, moving to annual data or something like that, and so the problem then would be the typical problem with annual data. So higher fluctuations, and so that would need to be taken into account. Time fixed effects. Then to the extent, true that we just heard from another paper that can be important, but to the extent that we have these averages across time, I thought it was less or a bit more innocuous not to include them. But of course, that could also be further to include in the paper. As for your comment on the Hansen test, yes, you're right, and I explicitly mentioned it in the presentation. It's why I used collaborative matrices later on and restricted the lag ranges of these estimations. So the results for the main, so for total financial assets, are robust to this. And by doing that, I arrived at normal, plausible, and simple Hansen tests. That's fine. That's not the case with intrafinancial assets. So as I do that, I probably lose a bit more precision. And with measures such as intrafinancial assets, which are in general differences in stocks, they're noisier than total financial assets. So probably the loss of precision using less instruments might hinder the estimation there. That's okay, but the main results are robust to more stringent estimation.